Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's really a relevant topic, as you all know. Every day you look in the paper, there's another shooting, and they range from 2 people being shot to a whole school being attacked. It's a current debate in Congress, debate in our own legislature. So we have 3 experts who are going to talk about international comparative gun policy. We have 2 DU professors that you're all very familiar with, Chris Snicchio and Ian Farrell, and an adjunct professor, Dave Kopel, who was, did I say that right?
Close enough. Yes, perfect now.
Dave Kopel, who is a good friend of mine, but he's also an adjunct professor here. He was the media critic for the Rocky Mountain News for a decade, and has also written a couple of books on guns and gun laws. So the way we're going to structure this presentation today is that each of the speakers are going to get 5 minutes to talk about what they think the problem is right now, whether it's law, enforcement, whatever they happen to think the problem is. Then they're going to talk, they're going to have another 5 minutes to talk about how international law and international gun policy might inform us or may have relevance at all to our debate here in this country. Then each of the panelists are going to be able to ask a question of the other panelists, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So I'm leaving 15 minutes for questions from you guys. So panelists, I'm going to ask you guys, I'm going to give you the high sign. You get 5 minutes for the first question, 5 minutes for the second question, and then 1 to 2 minutes to ask questions of your colleagues. You guys ready? So I'm going to start with Professor Kopel. I'm going to mash that each time I say it.
You're getting better and better.
What is the problem? So why does the United States seem to have such a higher incidence of gun violence than the rest of the world?
I looked into this question in depth when I wrote my first book called The Samurai, the Mountie, and the Cowboy: Should America Adopt the Gun Controls of Other Democracies? That was published in 1992, and immodestly I will tell you that it was named Book of the Year by the American Society of Criminology, Division of International Criminology. Without recapitulating the book, I will suggest that each country needs to have gun laws which fit the culture of that country. Japan has extremely stringent, highly repressive gun laws so that people can own air guns and shotguns after a licensing process that's maybe easier than getting a building permit in New York City, but is designed to be difficult. That fits with Japan's culture of submission to authority, submission to society, and of anti-individualism. Switzerland has more machine guns per capita than any other modern nation. Militia service is mandatory for all males aged 18 to 45, and Switzerland, like Japan, is an extremely safe country with very low crime of all type. The Swiss militia system effectively integrates people into society. As you may know, Switzerland is a trilingual nation, so the militia service may be the first time that someone from a French-speaking canton gets to spend a lot of time with people from the Italian or German-speaking cantons. Neither model is particularly appropriate for the United States, which is a much more individualist society. The idea that the difference between American homicide rates and the homicide rates in other countries is primarily because of guns, I think is incorrect. A simple way to tell is just look at the U.S. northern border states and their adjoining Canadian provinces. Gun laws are much more restrictive in Canada, and the crime rate in the provinces that border the states that border those Canadian provinces, which would be about as demographically similar as one might get for an experiment, the U.S. states generally have lower crime rates. But I want to suggest something much more important and broader. Let's say that the entire difference in homicide rates between the United States and these wonderfully repressive countries that are seen as models by the gun prohibition advocates in Europe, let's say that is exclusively due to the Second Amendment and America's more liberal firearms policy. We have about 12,000 homicides a year in the United States, approximately 2/3 of them perpetrated with firearms. And let's just pretend that none of them would occur if the United States had the same gun laws as Britain or France or whatever. And then let's round up and say the U.S. has an excess of 10,000 homicides per year solely because of the American right to keep and bear arms. So 10,000 per year gets you up to 100,000 per decade, or 1 million excess deaths over the course of a century. That would be a high estimate, but let's just use it for purposes of argument. Those excess deaths in America caused by the existence of gun rights are dwarfed by the excess deaths in Europe caused in the past century by the existence of gun control. The last century was the century of genocide. Everywhere genocide is perpetrated, the genocideers work assiduously to first disarm the intended victims. Some people claim that, that people with guns couldn't possibly do anything to resist genocide, it could never matter. Well, the people who are actually in the business of perpetrating genocide seem to think just the opposite. They always want disarmed victims. I talked about 1 million deaths in the United States. There were more than that in Poland in 1945 to 48, simply the first few years of the communist regime imposing its will on the people of Poland, far more than 1 million deaths from that genocide. Yugoslavia, not putting aside the civil war and the mass murders at Srebrenica, which happened because the UN disarmed people and then falsely told them that it would protect them and it didn't. Putting that aside, just what Tito did in the more stable period in Yugoslavia, you're over 1 million deaths. Then we can look at countries like Nazi Germany, where a gun control system set up with registration, set up by a liberal democracy, the Weimar Republic, was immediately perverted by the Nazis when they took power to make sure that all of their political opponents would be disarmed. And further intensified, of course, by the complete disarmament of the Jews and the Gypsies and everybody else they wanted to murder. The same story in the Soviet Union, in both as it originally existed and then as it expanded under Stalin. Tens of millions of murders caused by disarmament. Registration, confiscation, extermination. Not every country that has step 1 has step 2, and not every country that has step 2 has step 3. But every country that has step 3 has seen step 1 and step 2. Disarmament is the sine qua non of genocide. You can, and to the extent that people are not disarmed, they have a better chance of surviving.
Let me interject at that point, and because that's your 5 minutes, let me go to the next. We'll come back to your point.
Sounds
Professor
good.
Farrell?
So I think the question about what's different about the US is a tough one. Like as I think it was mentioned earlier, it's very, very difficult with any questions like this to isolate a single cause. The difference between the US and other countries could be, for example, the rate of gun ownership. So I think there are studies that show that in the United States there are about 89 firearms per 100 people is the figures that I saw when I looked at this, compared to other nations, and the one I'm most familiar with, in case you couldn't figure it out, is Australia, where the gun ownership rate is about 8 guns at the moment per 100 households. Sorry, per 100 people. Now there are also other things you can point to. There is higher crime rates in general in the United States, and while we can look at a general trend in terms of, if you look at countries across the world and did a scatterplot graph of gun ownership versus gun homicides, you would see an upward trend. The more guns there are, the higher the homicides. If you look, as Professor Kopel said, if you look at individual states in the United States, that is not the case. You would expect that if gun ownership was the sole or perhaps even primary cause of higher gun deaths, you would expect that trend to be replicated not only from nation to nation but also from state to state within the United States, and we don't see that. So I think that one of the other primary potential explanations is the degree of individualism, if not either in fact or in myth. So the mythology of the United States is very much one of individualist approaches to life and community and so forth. I think that I would hesitate to go as far as Professor Kopel did in terms of contrasting the United States with, say, Switzerland and Japan, and saying that Japan is a very repressive regime in this area. I think that, and I'll talk more about these details in the later section, but Australia is a useful example in this respect, because Australia is not as repressed a culture in this sense. It's not as, Australia is similar to the US in the way that it is anti-authoritarian, both legally and individually. We do not like people telling us what to do, which is why we hate the British. And so we really do have to look for a number of different causes. Another issue may be that unlike the countries of Western Europe, which are relatively homogenous in terms of ethnically, religiously, and so on and so forth, the US is a very multicultural and diverse country. Now that same factor applies to Canada and Australia, so maybe it's Canada and Australia are also very ethnically diverse, but they're not nearly as big population-wise as the US. So perhaps it's a combination of those factors. Perhaps it's an association with firearms that is related to the existence of the Second Amendment. Like it's important, I think, to recognize that law and culture is not a one-directional causal situation, right? Professor Kopel is absolutely right that we need to be aware of culture when figuring out what law is appropriate and will be effective, but similarly, law affects culture. And so I think that those are all things in the mix. I guess, in short, I don't think that there's any one clear, obvious sole contributor, but there are some important possible factors. And the one that I'm going to look at when I give you some more details of the Australian situation later on is gun control and the way that it affects rates of gun ownership.
Professor Muccio?
Yeah, I'm coming at this from a totally different place. Primarily looking at the United States discourse on gun control, which happens every time there is a mass shooting. And in terms of schools, if my memory serves me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the first mass shooting occurred in the 1960s at the University of Texas, when a fellow by the name of Whitman climbed up to a bell tower and started popping people off as he looked down. And from that moment on, there have been many, many shootings at schools, in the theaters, on the street. And we forget that the shootings that have taken place via gun violence with the different gangs, the Crips and the Bloods, the different gangs that exist. What's interesting about the conversation in the United States is that there is nothing that's been discussed about gender, not a word about the fact that the individuals who've been involved in these mass killings are all male. Does it say something about our culture in terms of how we raise our boys and our girls in this culture, that the way that we resolve disputes, generally speaking, is violence? We live in a very violent culture, and the violence has gotten even more extreme. Football is a violent sport, but now we have extreme football. Baseball, I mean, remember when A-Rod slapped the hand of the person running to base? Well, now they will attempt to cleat them so they can get to the base and stay on the base. The idea that we resolve disputes through violence is one of the issues that we are not willing to address. Obama hasn't addressed it. Pelosi hasn't addressed it. Feinstein hasn't addressed it in terms of the laws that they're putting into place. Simply outlawing guns without understanding how that contributes to the proliferation of violence in this culture is not going to solve the problem. It's simply the tip of the iceberg. And so I would be wanting to look at how we have a conversation about violence in this culture and how we have a conversation about how boys are raised in this culture. There's a wonderful book by a fellow by the name of William Pollack, who's written a book called Real Boys. And while it's a derivative from the feminist psychologists of the 1970s, the first one being Pauline Barr in 1970, who wrote The Psychology of Women, he locates the problem in terms of how boys are raised in this culture. Not to have the same type of affiliation that occurs among girls. And whether one agrees or disagrees with the notion of an acculturation process, we can see it in how it gets played out in violent crime. Now, some folks will say, well, girls are getting more violent in the 21st century. That may be true, but in terms of mass murders in this country, it's done by white males, and we don't even begin to have a conversation. Not one person has raised this with any seriousness in terms of public policy. And I think the reason is because it comes too close to home, much too close to home. Because the notion of raising our children and how we raise our children and what messages those kids get as they're moving through their journey into adolescence and into adulthood is something that we as adults must take responsibility for. Okay? There are countless articles that have talked about the fact that when the United States was attacked on September 11, 2001, and as a native New Yorker who lost friends in that horrific moment, both in the Pentagon and at the World Trade Center, my initial reaction when I heard what was happening, I was in California at the time, was quote unquote, bomb them into the Stone Age, as if that would solve the problem. Instead of coming to terms with it, the answer is not responding through violence. The answer is finding an alternative way to come to a conclusion about the political, the diplomatic, and the community issues that affect us in this world. Why is it that the way that we resolve problems in our families is through domestic violence? Why is it the way that we deal with our children is through physical abuse? Why is it that the way that many folks in Catholic schools were dealt with, which we're finding out now in Ireland in the Magdalena situation, was physical violence if they didn't do what the nuns wanted them to do? What does this say about our culture? We have a culture...
Let me intervene right there.
Yeah, I'll stop.
Yeah. Really interesting perspectives on different points. So the next question then, I'm going to start with Professor Farrell, is what does the experience of other countries' relationship with guns have for the United States? What lessons learned are there for us?
Okay, so I'm just going to give you an example of the gun law changes that happened in Australia over the about 15 years ago. So Australian firearm laws have, in general, been fairly strict. So, for instance, you always had to have a permit to acquire a gun before you're allowed to buy a firearm. And there was a mandatory 28-day waiting period once you got the permit before you're allowed to buy. In order to get this permit, you had to have a genuine reason for possessing a gun. And those reasons included things like being a member of a sports shooting club, hunting, pest control. Does anyone know why pest control might have been on the list?
Kangaroos.
Kangaroos, exactly.
British.
Not the British. That's another section. Yeah, so and
1775.
right, exactly. Now, what's interesting about these this genuine reason requirement is that self-defense was not one of the reasons that satisfied this requirement. In addition, handguns in particular were very closely regulated, so that if you wanted to own a handgun, you also had to show that you were in. The only reason you could have a handgun was for sports shooting, and you had a 6-month probationary period whereby you had to actually participate in a certain number of competitions, otherwise your gun would then be illegal. So the background was that even before these new laws, the situation was fairly strict compared to the US. Now in 1996 there was an incident in Port Arthur, which is a fairly popular tourist destination in Tasmania, and a crazy guy with several rifles killed 35 people. And the response to this was that within about 2 weeks, the quite conservative federal government convinced the state governments, because it's a federal system similar to the US, to enact new gun laws, which primarily the difference was that they banned semi-automatic and pump-action rifles and shotguns. And so they said, these are no longer legal under any circumstances for whatever reason, and because we're now making them illegal, we are instigating an amnesty period. And if you give us back the guns within the amnesty period, we'll give you what was determined by a panel of experts to be fair market value. And if you had guns after that, then you were guilty of a crime. Approximately 650,000 guns were bought back and destroyed. And so if you factor in for the population difference, so per capita, that would be around about the same as 60 million guns in the US. That was a 20% reduction in the number of guns within Australia, and because of the number of households that have more than one gun and so forth, most estimates say that it cut the number of households with guns from about 15% of households down to about 8% of households. So what was the effect of this? Was it effective or was it ineffective? There have been a number of studies that have been done on this. So one fact that is pointed to is that between 1986 and 1996, there were 10 shootings in Australia that had more than 3 victims. So what the literature describes as mass shootings. So 10 from 86 to 96. Since 1996, there have been 0. Now, of course, that could be due to other factors, so I'm not suggesting that that's the be-all and end-all. It's just an interesting data point to keep in mind. The firearm suicide rate has dropped by 74%. So the number of people who are committing suicide using guns has dropped by 74%. One explanation for this could be that people who no longer have guns are still committing suicide but using a different method. The studies that I've looked at suggest that there has not been this substitution effect. And so the actual number of suicides has dropped. The firearm homicide rate, the studies say, is harder to pin down, but they suggest somewhere in the range of between 35 and 50% less homicides using guns per year. There has been also a drop in the total number of homicides, but substantially less, so that it would appear that at least some of the result of lowering the death toll is due to the guns themselves.
Let me intervene right there and give Professor Michio the next response. So what lessons learned are there for the US from other countries?
My experience has been mostly anecdotal by spending a lot of time in Ireland. And I will never forget when I walked up to a police officer and I said, you don't carry guns? And he said, no, we don't carry guns here, you know. We only have one specific department that carries the guns. And I said, how is it possible that you can make an arrest? And he said, well, you know, I have an arresting personality. What was interesting about this is that I remember growing up in New York City, in a Roman Catholic, highly concentrated by Irish Catholics, and we knew where our money was going, and we knew what our money was being used for. It was being used to purchase guns to be given to the IRA. Many of the guns that were used in Northern Ireland were purchased from the United States, as were the guns that were purchased during the conflict between the Haganah and the British in the 1940s. We were one of the chief providers of weapons. Now, in terms of conceptions of self-defense, I have no problems. In terms of using it as a weapon in order to impose my will upon an individual, I have a problem with it. I remember distinctly, I was in Northern Ireland at the University, Queen's College, at the Institute of Governance, giving a talk about domestic violence, and it was the day that the decision from the Supreme Court was handed down about the Second Amendment, and all of the people in the who were there that day were stunned that the United States believed there was a fundamental right to have a gun. It's alien in the concept in Ireland, even in Northern Ireland, notwithstanding the fact that there was an enormous amount of violence that was occurred up until about '98 with the Good Friday Agreement, and now it's exploded again based on other political issues. But it's an alien concept. In fact, in the Irish Times, it's a big deal when somebody uses a gun. The homicide rate is very low in Ireland, in the Republic, notwithstanding the fact that the unemployment rate is extremely high. The same in Northern Ireland, it's extremely low, homicide rate. On the other hand, theft of cars, auto theft is high in Ireland, in the Republic, and in Northern Ireland. I don't know how they get the cars, I don't know, they don't use guns. But my only concern is the fact that the conversation is not a complete conversation. And we're deluding ourselves if we think that simply restricting access to guns is going to stop gun violence in this country, number one. Number two is, I don't think it's fair to look at states that have had very restrictive gun laws and say, oh, well, there are still homicides, because they were merely oases surrounded by jurisdictions that didn't have restrictive gun laws. A great example is New York City. New York City has very restrictive policies regarding guns, and you have to have all these permits to concealed carry and all this stuff. And living in upstate New York, you don't have those restrictions in the different villages and towns. Well, where do you think they're getting the guns from? They're bringing them in from other jurisdictions. It's not that somehow we can really weigh what happens in the United States, because the policies vary from city to city, from state to state. So it's very, very difficult. But the real issue here is why we have such a gun culture. What is it about the United States? Is it John Wayne? What is it? Yes, you go hunt if you'd like. Go ahead, kill Bambi if you would like to kill Bambi. But you don't need an AK-47 to do that. Obama was shown skeet shooting. Knock yourself out. But you don't need a Glock 9mm to do that. You want to go and play with your friends in a range to shoot. Fine, go ahead. You don't need automatic weapons to do that. And if you have this desire to do that, get a paintball. Get an air gun. Okay? It can still hurt, but it may not kill. The other piece that's extremely important, that's missing, is the idea that somehow these incidences of violence take place in a vacuum. They don't. And there are mental health issues, there are gender issues, and there are the acculturation issues that take place. If we don't address all of that, simply saying you can't have a magazine that has 30 rounds in it, and if you do, you can only have one, is not going to stop the violence until we, as a culture, say, not in my name.
That's cool.
Australia and Ireland, of which the latter of which I happen to be a dual citizen, both demonstrate registration leads to confiscation. The Australia confiscation was thought up by the John Howard government, written out in detail, and then ready to spring on the public at a great moment of crisis and national concern. Long before the Tasmania murders, this legislation was ready to go, the confiscation was planned, and that was the moment to do it. We see the same thing going on here. Everything that's being discussed after the Sandy Hook murders is part of, essentially drafted by New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg's organization and pushed around the country at an opportune time for political exploitation. Studies are mixed on what happened in Australia. A book that I contributed to, the Brookings Institution's book, Evaluating Gun Policy. And I can tell you that the Brookings Institution is a very respected center-left think tank in DC. Their study on Australia said that what was euphemistically called the buyback, more properly confiscation, since the government didn't own the guns in the first place, had not had any beneficial effects in terms of saving lives or reducing crime rates in general. But as Professor Farrell points out, there are other studies to the contrary. We do see that shortly after the gun ownership rate household gun ownership rate in Australia was cut by 50% by this mass confiscation, there were at least reports in Australia of a sharp rise in home invasion burglaries, of attacks in a home when the occupants were there. The Australian government said, well, we can't really be sure about that because we're still trying to figure out how to define a home invasion, a rather specious way of avoiding what I think they saw was coming from the data. We know in Ireland and in the United Kingdom that the home invasion burglaries are far more common than in the United States. Now, burglary rates can vary from country to country. So if you look at total burglaries, let's say the 7-Eleven got burglarized when there was no one there, somebody's house got broken into when they were at work, and the coin collection was stolen. All of those, total burglary rate, the United States is lower than England and Wales, but higher than Scotland, because for historic reasons Scotland keeps its criminal statistics separate. But what happens on that island of Great Britain and in Ireland is when you look at the home burglaries of residences, the percentage of burglaries that take place when nobody is home, when the residents are home, is over 50% over there. It's only about 12 or 13% here. It's terrible that somebody breaks in and takes your coin collection and your CDs and your iPod, but it's a lot better, and especially if you've got children at home, that happens when they're not there. And the reason that it happens in America, mainly when they're not there, the reason that American burglars, in the studies of active burglars, professionals who are succeeding and not in prison, as well as the ones who've been imprisoned, they say the biggest part of our working day is casing the joint to make sure there's nobody there. Why do they not do that over in London when they do burglaries? Because in London, when you go in and there's somebody home, you get their purses and their wallets with cash. Immediately fungible, and you don't have to sell it to a fence at a discount. In the United States, they work so hard to make sure there's nobody home and get something that's less valuable, since it's not cash. They have to sell it at a discount. And the reason they say is because the risk of getting shot is so high in the United States. 50% of gun homes in this country have a firearm, and unless you put up a sticker that says this is a gun-free home, you get a free ride or benefit from all your neighbors who do have firearms. According to the Centers for Disease Control, not one of the top pro-gun research organizations in this country, they did a study of American burglars. They found there were 600,000 cases annually of defensive gun use against home invaders. The vast majority of those ended without a shot even being fired. the sound of a shotgun being racked, of the pump-action shotgun, which Americans can own and Australians can't, is a quite distinctive sound and tends to convince burglars that it's really time to leave work early today. So we have, I'll finally very briefly say that at least some of us have been talking about issues of gender for a long time, including in my book, published in 1996, Guns, Who Should Have Them? The mass shooters are overwhelmingly male and young. They are the classic onset age for schizophrenia, late teens, early 20s. There's a serious mental health problem, and it's not just a mental health problem about saying put them on some list so they can't buy a gun, because if they're violently mentally ill, and even if you imagine they don't get a gun in a country with 300 million guns already, they can still do lots of dangerous things. About 1/6 of U.S. homicides are perpetrated by mentally ill people. We could cut that homicide rate by better funding and better laws for civil commitment. That's one of the big differences between the early 60s and now, is a lot of those every one of those murders, James Holmes, Adam Lanza, on and on, would have been committed under the laws we had in the early 1960s. And as for how boys are raised, well, you know, they were raised in arguably an even more violent culture in the 1950s, and we didn't have a serious homicide rate problem as later developed, and it's gone down. Our homicide rate's gone down by 50% in the last 30 years, but I'd still prefer it to go down more. You can disaggregate the statistics, and the boys who learn how to control their emotions are not the ones who are perpetrating crimes, and learning how to control your emotions is for adolescent males very much something about whether there is an older male authority figure in that person's life or not. Final point, from Australia to New York State, a study of Australian Aborigines who, they come from a gun culture, very rural. Of the criminals, Aboriginal criminals in Australian prisons, which ones had used guns against other people in their crimes and which ones had not used guns in crimes? The ones who had not used guns in crimes had grown up around guns and said, no, guns are for like shooting tucker, which means game. And they would never think of using a gun against someone else. The ones who had used guns against people or carried them in a crime such as an armed robbery were ones who had not been acculturated into a positive, constructive gun culture by an older authority figure. Same issue, upstate New York, another study done of juvenile delinquents. The ones who have grown up in a family where they learn about guns from their father or their uncle at the target range almost never used guns in crimes. The ones who had learned about guns on the streets were overwhelmingly the ones who would use guns in crimes. Part of reducing criminal gun violence is making sure that as many children as possible are socialized into a positive, constructive culture of responsible gun use. Thank you.
So I'm going to start this, Professor Michio. You get to ask a question of your fellow panelists. We're going to go very brief, 1 or 2 minutes.
Oh, where do I begin? You mentioned that that the homicide rate has decreased.
Yes.
My question would be this, and you mentioned the 1950s. New York City did a study of its schools and and violence in the schools, and they saw that there was a difference in the different generations. So you had kids in schools who resorted to using chains, and then you had the kids, the next generation, were using knives, and now they're using guns. So isn't it fair to say that this type of resorting to the weapon of choice has changed over time?
If the New York study says that, sure. But it's gone exactly the opposite of New York City gun laws. Antonin Scalia, growing up in Queens in New York City, carried his rifle on the subway to school to participate in the school's target shooting programs. So the fact that his fellow students, who were, as they were called, juvenile delinquents in the 1950s, were fighting each other with switchblades or bicycle chains or whatever, was not because they couldn't get guns. It's because they didn't want guns and they didn't want to escalate the violence to that level. New York City laws are immensely more repressive now towards law-abiding gun owners. And part of the consequence of that is the destruction in New York City and Chicago of a culture of responsible gun ownership. So when you've got that 19-year-old male who's on the fringe between crime and being law-abiding, one of the things he doesn't have when he grows up in Chicago or New York is any constructive examples of the positive, responsible way to be a gun owner. No more target shooting programs in the schools where the coach shows you all about gun safety, about responsibility, and the right way and the right attitudes to have about guns. It's all negative, all the opposite these days in Chicago and New York City, and that is an important component of why those cities have their problems and why Chicago is a more dangerous place for a young person than Afghanistan.
Professor Kopel, do you have a question for your fellow panelists?
Can I pass?
You can pass. Professor Farrell? We can also go to the students' questions.
Can I ask 2 questions?
See how good the first one is.
All right.
I delegate my question to you.
All right, I'll start with the first one and then see if I want to ask a second. And that is, the gender and violence thing is fascinating. And I think that it's, I mean, if you look at crime generally, and then especially violent crime, it is unbelievably gendered, not only in terms of, if you look at violent crime, not only in terms of the perpetrators but the victims.
Yeah.
I guess my question would be, if you look at the homicide rates in the United States versus other, let's call them Western democracies, the homicide rate in the US is significantly higher, but I don't see necessarily that the gender acculturation is worse, let's say, in the US than Australia. So I grew up in Australia, and if you didn't play rugby, you were a wimp, and you know, it was a fairly violent, gendered, in some ways I think even more pressure to be a man, let's say, and the violent connotations that go with that than there is in the US. And so is there something else going on that differentiates the American experience from the experience of other countries?
My sense, I would ask you this question. Again, this is the experiences I've had in Ireland, both in the Republic and in Italy also. That when you talk about violence, the way you've discussed it, it's confined to the rugby pitch, or the you know, the other games that you play in Australia. The idea, you know, the idea that that when you're raised in this country, growing up as a child, you know, even little girls, me included, would strap on a little gun outfit, a little cowboy hat, and we would play the god-awful game of cowboys versus Indians, which now I realize how awful that was when I was a kid.
Not my kind of Indians.
That's correct. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I mean, I think that from a very, very young age, being weaned on popular culture and the media, that guns are very, very present. And when you mix that with the idea that in order to express yourself, or to have self-esteem, or to be manly in this culture, you need to strike out. It's a prescription, I think, for violence in a way that is totally unacceptable. I mean, I guess my concern is, why do we have to have guns? Fine, as I say, target shooting is fantastic. Killing Bambi, I don't agree with that until we arm Bambi and the bears, but you know, the idea that I would have my child go to school to learn about guns is enormously frightening to me, because those things can be used to harm. And when people say to me, oh well, there are other things that can be used to harm, you know what, it's a lot easier to hurt someone with a gun than it is with a knife, or in New York, chukka sticks, or brass knuckles, because there you're getting up and personal. And so many times we hear of incidences in New York where kids were injured because they were showing off their daddy's gun or their mommy's gun, and the gun goes off. So I just...
Can I cut you off
Yeah.
there? Because you made that good point. I want to make sure that we have 10 minutes for,
Oh, I'm
for the
sorry.
students. That's okay. So, take first question. Speak up loudly because we're trying to record this, please. Yep.
Actually, I have a question regarding something which Professor Mikio briefly touched on, which is the effects of U.S. gun control laws on other countries. And I wanted to know from an international law perspective if you think that there's any recourse which other countries, such as, for example, Mexico, which has 93% of the cartel's guns come from the U.S., is there any recourse which they could take to influence the United States towards moving towards more stringent gun control laws?
No.
Do you want to take that?
Pardon?
I've got it.
International law?
I'll let you know.
To answer your question, it's been gamed out, and it is not impossible that Mexico could bring suit against the United States in the World Court, providing the United States consents to jurisdiction, which this president might. It should be said that the United States has the most stringent laws in the country against unauthorized firearms exports. I will also say the 93% figure was a fake. The studies show that of Mexican crime guns, roughly guns seized, 12% come from the U.S. domestic market some way, and the average age of those is about 14 years, which indicates they're stolen guns, rather than, say, if they were 3-month-old guns, which would indicate they've been recently purchased for the purpose of trafficking into Mexico. Mexico is insanely lax about its southbound border controls. It's called the Ant Trail. There's a lot of smuggling going on southbound, not at the big 15-lane crossings at, say, El Paso, but on the smaller things where you take a little ferry across a river. The Fast and Furious scheme of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms under the Obama administration and its predecessor, Operation Wide Receiver, under the Bush administration. Under Bush, 500 guns were deliberately put into the hands of mainly the Sinaloa cartel. 2,000 guns, done the same thing under the Obama administration. In both cases, those are flagrant violations of the Arms Export Control Act, a major felony to do that for every single gun without State Department authorization. And I find it outrageous and very wrong that none of those people in the Obama Department of Justice, and we don't know how high it goes, but there's some level, who were knowing conspirators in a program to put guns into the hands of the Sinaloa drug cartel. Not one of them is being criminally prosecuted for that.
Will?
So Professor Michio said something which I think needs to be addressed and is a point, I think, of ignorance in this country. She talked about nobody needs an AK-47 and then talked about automatic weapons. Now, the rules for automatic weapons have not changed since 1934. In fact, there's a registration tax of $200 which has not changed. And automatic weapons, whether we're talking about submachine guns or heavy machine guns or fully automatic M4s, make up 1% of all gun crime in the U.S. since they were banned. Reagan had a quote that said you don't need an AK-47 to defend yourself. That may be true, but what we're talking about with assault weapons these days is a series of weapons which are cosmetically different from other weapons that do the exact same thing. And the only difference is that they are cosmetically different. They have a pistol grip or a lug that you can put a bayonet on, but they're not automatic weapons. They're just semi-automatic weapons that are cosmetically different from other weapons that are used in crime. Banning them would not take away the ability of somebody to buy a weapon that does the exact same thing. The assault weapon ban from the 1990s banned weapons that had 2 or more components of 5 that if you had more than that, they would be banned. But it didn't mean that you couldn't buy a .223 semi-automatic rifle. So if we're talking about weapons, we're talking about guns, we need to be very specific about what we're talking about. Because we're not talking about banning automatic weapons here. We're talking about banning a series of cosmetically different weapons that do the exact same thing that other semi-automatic weapons do. And if we're not addressing that, if we're talking about automatic weapons as if they're the same things that we're talking about banning, then there's a serious problem both with the policy that will emerge and with the coverage that will be gained from it. And that's really a point that can be responded to or not.
Go ahead, yes.
So, sure.
Yeah.
So if you write a law which is going to ban a certain kind of weapon, don't use the term assault weapon. Ban automatic weapons or semi-automatic weapons. Great. Yeah.
Yes, and Australian law, bad as it was, at least had that coherence of not pretending that one semi-automatic is a nice gun and then something functionally similar that has a forward pistol grip on it is an evil gun, and we're only going to ban half of them. I mean, either ban all semi-automatics or ban none. And by the way, semi-automatics, as has been pointed out, they fire one bullet every time you press the trigger, just like every other regular gun. They're, by definition, not automatics.
It makes no sense, any of this to me, unless you deal with the issue of why people resort to wanting to use guns, whether it's a .38 or a Glock 9mm. In the city of New York, police used to carry .38s. They started to carry Glock 9mm because they were faced with semi-automatic and automatic weapons from individuals who were perpetrating crime. For me, this is all cosmetic. The whole thing is cosmetic, and it's a fraud as far as I'm concerned, because people who want to get guns will get guns, no matter what we do. Think about it for a moment. 25 years ago, have nothing to do with guns. 25 years ago, it was a joke if you left the holiday party drunk with a lampshade on your head. Now, we have all these, I mean, when my kid went to the prom, we had to sign all these contracts, we had designated drivers, you had zone-free places. It became unpopular, at least, to be driving while intoxicated. Did it wipe it out? No, it did not. Did it stop binge drinking on college campuses? No, it did not. But at least we were having a conversation about the fact that getting in your vehicle and turning on the ignition was unacceptable if you were legally drunk. We're not having this conversation about the use of weapons and different types of weapons, not just guns, but fists, knives, chuck-a-sticks. It's unbelievable to me that we're not having this conversation. We're confining it to what happened at Sandy Hook without realizing that this situation is going to continue to happen if we don't come to terms with the fact that we live in a violent culture and that violence is cool. It's cool.
Yes.
Okay, Professor, I forgot your name.
Michio.
Michio. One of your first questions, and you've addressed that again, is why does anyone need a Glock 9mm? My daughter's 21. She carries a Glock 9mm. The reason is pretty simple. First of all, it's fairly small. It's easy to shoot. She's small, a small person. She's living right now in Boulder where the rape rate has gone up. Well, actually, it's gone down now. And why has it gone down? Because concealed carry has been made legal on campus. So we actually have a good scientific example of this. The rape rate in the UK, since they have made guns, since they've banned guns, has gone up. The rape rate in the US, specifically in states that have concealed carry, has gone down. Because, no, criminals are chicken. They're going after the weakest person in the link. The weakest, they're like the lions. They're going to get the straggler who can't protect himself. And you're telling me that my daughter can't protect herself from that larger man on campus that's going to potentially rape her, stop her and rape her. You're shaking your head no, right? But it's okay to blame the men, but it's not okay to protect yourself from the men.
You missed my point completely.
And you also said that we haven't had any female mass shootings. We've had several.
Excuse me, let's let Professor Michio respond to the first question.
I mean,
we'll get one more question, hopefully.
You know, the idea, I mean, what was coming out at first of all, we don't know. You haven't demonstrated there's a causal relationship between the carrying of guns and the reducive rate. You haven't demonstrated that, number one. Number two is, and if you have studies, I'd like to see them, and where they came from. Like if they
The
came from
numbers
the
came
NRA.
from the UN.
The other issue is the idea that after Sandy Hook, we had individuals who were advocating that you have individuals in schools who are armed. I talked to principals in schools after the Sandy Hook, friends of mine who were principals in New York, and I said to them, is that a wise thing to do? And they said, that's absolutely absurd. Because even if the cop is on the 3rd floor, the individual bursts into the 1st floor, one person isn't going to be able to stop them. The idea that the way that we deal with violence is beyond me. Now, am I saying that your daughter shouldn't carry a Glock 9mm? I don't think anybody should carry a Glock 9mm because the data also shows that individuals who carry guns, those guns are used against them when they become victims of crime. And unless you know how to use the Glock millimeter and you are willing to kill, not to maim, but to kill the individual, it's the same thing that happened during the
Professor
classes.
Mitchell,
I guarantee you,
Oh, I'm
my
sorry.
daughter knows how to
Professor Kopel, do you want to
stop.
If I could just
an assailant.
Hang on.
clarify a few points that have been raised. Professor Michi, I'd be happy to show you the various studies. There have been about 24 on the effect of fair licensing laws for people to obtain permits to carry firearms. Some of them say no statistics, at least statistically significant discernible effects. Other studies find reductions in homicides or rapes or aggravated assaults. Their consensus seems to be it does not cause a problem, so you're either, in a statistical sense, either neutral or better off. It would be the main line of those studies. In terms of guns being taken away from the defender and used against them, that's something on which we actually got a lot of data coming from the National Crime Victimization Survey. Professor Gary Kleck has gotten into it, and I talk about this a lot in my amicus brief in Heller, written on behalf of the 2 major police training organizations in the United States and a large coalition of other law enforcement organizations. Takeaways are in fact extremely rare. And by the way, another thing that is extremely rare is, fortunately, is fatal gun accidents involving children. That rate per capita has fallen by over 95% over the last half century. One of the reasons for that among the reasons are safety programs like the NRA's Eddie Eagle. He's like Smokey the Bear. He teaches safety. If you see a gun, stop, don't touch, leave the area, tell an adult. We need, as you say, we've got a lot of guns already. You don't understand why people would want them, but for whatever reason, we do. We got slightly, by my count, slightly more guns than people in this country. Taking that into account, the responsible thing to do is to promote responsible acculturation and use of firearms. I wouldn't force anybody to do it, but I'd like to be as open as possible. One quick point, Utah, our neighbor state, if you are a teacher in the public schools in Utah and you have a permit to carry a firearm everywhere in the state, issued by the state police, your place of work is not off limits to you. You can carry guns in the public schools if you're a public school teacher. They have never had any problems with that. It works in Utah, and by the way, we haven't had attacks on schools in Utah. I'm not saying it's cause and effect for sure, but what we can say for sure is after many years of experience in Utah, allowing teachers the option to carry, if they pass the fingerprint-based background check and the safety training class, does not cause problems.
But you don't know if carrying in a school is the reason in Utah why they don't have school shootings.
No, that's right.
Let me try to squeeze.
That's right.
So-
First of all, do we have to end it now? It's
Yeah.
exactly 1.
It's 1 o'clock.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't take your question.